You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Well, hey everyone, welcome back to Faith and Other Oddities, the show where Emily and I read the Bible, talk about it, and discuss it for all to hear and enjoy, hopefully. So, Hopefully, yes. That's the key. So, last week and the week before, we were in Psalm 22, and we're probably going to be there for a while based on our previous state of progress, or rate of progress, I should say.
Yeah, well, this is the gift that keeps on giving. There's just so much in here that without like the historical and the religious context and everything that's going on at that time period, you just don't get how significant it is. And you and I were talking before we started recording, and we went everywhere. But, one of the things we were talking about is how you and I are typically not psalm people. We
Right.
it's not really, you talk to a lot of people, the first thing they say, oh, my favorite book of the Bible is. And I have found that as I'm going through this, that I'm just getting so much out of this that I might be kind of shifting just a little bit. Of course, my favorite book is whatever book I'm studying at the time. So, but, if you don't have that context and you don't have that background, it is just pretty little words put together. It doesn't have the same impact. And I love the fact that as I'm kind of being quote unquote forced, because this is the podcast and, it is it's the next section. It's made me go back and reconsider. And I've thought about how often when I'm doing Bible study, that really is the case. If there's a part of the Bible that I've been bored by or I'm not interested in, if I actually sit down and study it, I usually wind up absolutely loving it. So, so if there's a part that anybody finds themselves bored by or uninterested in, maybe that's just a good sign that it's time to go back and really dig in and see what you're missing.
Well, yeah. Well, similar to that is, the people who like, and this is kind of what we address throughout our whole show. We haven't said it like this specifically in a while, but it's kind of like those problem passages and weird things that happen that people say, oh, well, I lost my faith because I read the Old Testament. And, if you come across, much like if you're bored with something, just dive deeper. Or, the people who say that they lost their faith because of a certain passage, because, well, it's because they didn't study it. They brushed up against it and decided they didn't like it.
Or they started to study it, but they didn't have all of the setting to put it in. And, that's one of the things. I mean, I'm not saying that things are automatically easier because you study things. But there's usually a depth there. There's usually something behind the scenes that you're missing. And we're actually going to talk about, because one of the big things about the Old Testament is violence. And there's so much violence in the Old Testament. Absolutely, there is. I'm not going to deny that. But we're going to talk about that violence and the purpose it serves and why it might be necessary. So, because that's part of the psalm is addressing that sort of violence and how it's not just pointless violence. There is actually a point to it. There's a reason we have it, and it could have actually been necessary. And we're going to talk about why it could be necessary, but we'll get there. So, like I said, there's just a lot. I think I'm up to like 100 and something pages on this particular psalm. And I just want to pick up, we'd started into the stanza verses 10 through 16. And I just want to read through those again and kind of get us back in context, and then we'll pick up where we left off on the discussion of that stanza. It says, he bowed the heavens and came down, thick darkness was under his feet. Now, actually, I love the Hebrew there. It's less bowed, and it's more he tilted the heavens. So the idea that God absolutely disrupted the balance of the heavens on the psalmist's behalf. He rode a cherub and flew and was seen on the wings of the wind. He made darkness around him his canopy, thick clouds, a gathering of water. And that's where we're going to pick up. Out of the brightness before him, coals flamed forth. The Lord thundered from heaven, and the Most High uttered his voice. And he sent out arrows and scattered them. Lightning routed them. The channels of the sea were seen, and the foundations of the world laid bare, and the rebuke of the Lord at the blast of his and at the rebuke of the Lord and at the blast of the breath of his nostrils. So we talked some last week about how this really borrowed from familiar language in that culture and that time, and we see the same kind of language in other contemporary writings about the gods. And we talked about how effective communication deals with shared language. If you don't have that shared language, you cannot communicate with the person you're trying to communicate with. And so we don't need to see this as a way to discount what the Bible's saying or simply say, oh, well, the Bible just borrows from all these other ancient myths and repackage them. That's not what's going on. This is always, always about showing God's superiority to other gods and deities that claim to have the same attributes and power.
I mean, just because that's what, 90s and early 2000s pop Christian entertainment was, doesn't mean that's what they were doing. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, pretty much. And and the other thing too is we got to remember these other gods, these lesser Elohim or the godlets, they had witnessed this from God. They had seen things that humanity had not seen. And why in the world wouldn't they imitate it as a way to get closer to being what the true God was?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, we as human beings do this. If we admire someone, we start cutting our hair like that person. We start wearing the same brands that they do. If humans can do it, why wouldn't the spiritual realm be capable of doing the same thing? So it's not a big mystery. It's very simple. We have some, we don't even have to stretch our brains to come up with an answer. And so, but we also talked about how this is a psalm that was originally written by a king to describe his personal experience. Now, kings, as we've talked about many times on this podcast, are representations or even considered embodiments of the gods in certain culture. So the idea that a king could see and experience this in his life, not unheard of, not too crazy out there. The minute it becomes a really wild ride with this psalm is it's put in the collective psalm book for the nation, when each and every individual can claim this as a truth for themselves. It's not just a truth for a king. It's not a truth for the elites. It's not truth for just a certain part of the population. It's everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got to remember at this point in time, the idea that all of humanity, and we were talking about this before the podcast, was created in the image of God
mm-hmm.
and had access to God. That's radical.
Yeah.
That is.
Well, I mean,
it totally.
You see,
it changes reality.
Yeah, you see that play. You just see it playing out in history in the way that this idea came through Israel initially. You see it coming from the king into the everyday
Mm-hmm.
man, and and that's the thing. Like, Abraham wasn't really a king,
right?
But who was there before? There was the priest Melchizedek, who he was the one who was in charge, but God decided, hey, no, I'm going to talk to Abraham, who's just a guy. Well, I mean, just a guy. He had a lot of stuff, but he was a rich guy. But he moved it away from. He wasn't royalty. He moved it away from the kingship and away from the priesthood. And
mm-hmm. then you have Jacob
ahead.
and Esau, where the younger son is consistently chosen, where the one who wasn't supposed to have the status is elevated. And part of the purpose in that is to demonstrate this is for everyone.
Yeah. Then you have Joseph. I mean, elevated to a kingly, near kingly status in Egypt. He wasn't Pharaoh, but he was put in charge of a lot of stuff. I mean,
and he's not the oldest son,
right? Exactly. That's yeah. So I was playing off of that, the idea of not the oldest. And then it just keeps going, and then you have this psalm where it goes from being the kingly person who's saying these things, but when you move it into the psalm book, it goes from being something that the king did, like you said, to something everyone was participating in. And we see that over and over and over, right down to Jesus, where it gets to we are, the priesthood of all believers, that anyone has access to the divine, for lack of better terms. simply by virtue of following Christ. And so it's really cool. And whenever you look at the whole pattern versus, again, when we break the gospel into, just these points, just these talking points, it really is kind of boring to hear the story about someone got mad at me and they want to punish me. And if I just say I'm sorry, they'll forgive me. I mean, that's, I get that there is the element of forgiveness and repentance in the gospel. I don't want to discount that, but when we make it only about those things, it gets a little self-centered and we lose the story.
Well, and then it's about what can we get. It's not about a relationship. It's about a payoff.
Mhm.
And so we want it to be relational. And I know that that's a big topic out there, this big buzzword that, it's a relationship, not a religion. One real quick way that I want to respond to that, spirituality, and I've said this before, spirituality is what you believe. And everybody believes something about the spiritual realm. I don't care who you are. You either deny it, so you have a belief that way, you embrace it, you have a belief that way. Religion is how you live out what you believe. So everyone is technically living out their religion, whether we're talking about an organized religion where you go to a church or you go to some kind of building and perform rituals, that's a religion, or whether it's just your avoidance of those places. So we all live out our beliefs.
Mhm.
And technically that's all a religion is the living out of what we believe. And I think sometimes we forget that Christianity is amazing because it's not so much about the ritual, it's about the relationship that inspires you to participate in the ritual.
Mhm.
And you need to be inspired to participate in the things of the kingdom. And if you're not inspired, then you probably need to do one of those relationship health checks and try to figure out what's wrong, that you're not being inspired by the presence of God, the presence of Christ, to actually try to do what you believe to be is true.
Mhm.
And so,
Well, and even to play on that more than just because I think the problem is everyone wants to boil it down and everyone wants to boil it down to these short little pithy statements. But the problem is people sometimes will take these like short little memory tools and treat them like that's the whole of the truth. But you have to understand you should use those little things as doorways to into things you should ponder. And more so than it's not a religion, it's a relationship idea that, it's such a catchy little, alliterative phrase that we get to use to help us remember things. But I like, like when Dr. Heiser talks about, it's not about ceremony. It's not about this transactional thing that happens whenever we have ritual. It's about being part of the divine family, because whenever you talk about it that way, it becomes more than just, it's more than just, it's a relationship, like, I'm dating God, kind of thing. Or it becomes like, no, building a family. There's a huge difference between a relationship that has so many different levels. I mean, you could have friends, you could have a dating relationship, you could have a engagement or whatever. But that's different than building a family. So that's, and that's
a good twist.
That's kind of what we're looking at when we talk about it being a relationship, is being part of God's family, as opposed to, it's just about it's just about how well, it's just about how well I'm getting on with Jesus. That sounds, that's a totally different kind of way of looking at it.
Yeah, well, and I don't want to get too far into this, but that does shed some light on why the family is often one of the first things attacked in spiritual realm. Because if you lose that model of what a family is supposed to look like and how they're supposed to function, then how are you going to understand the higher truths of the divine family? So, I'm not saying it can't happen. There's been a lot of people who've come from broken relationships. I mean, we could talk about my husband, and I know he'd love it if I did. But, he came from a crazy family background, and, he's decided he didn't want that to be his reality with us. So, you aren't condemned to recreate what you've experienced. So, I don't want anyone to think, oh, well, I've got to come from this good 2-parent home and everything was great if I'm going to understand God's family. No, because sometimes you can look at what went wrong in your family of origin and go, that's not of God. That's not what God would want in our relationship. So, don't ever think you're disqualified from participating just because you don't have the quote unquote right credentials. So that's the whole point of the psalm is and that's to bring in that inclusive factor that this is true for everyone. So, okay, so we'll get back to the psalm because you and I have been our brains have been twirling around this morning, and we talked for an hour and a half before we started recording. So, okay, so I want to look at go ahead.
Oh no, I just maybe after we're done with this show, we should talk about the attack on the family more, and we can put that in Patreon. We need to do more of those, but there's some points I think would be interesting to talk about on that. So, but
okay,
I don't want to go too far afield on this episode, and I don't have all my notes on it, so it's one of those. So I'm going to talk about it and not have all the notes. We should do it on the other side.
Yeah, people who love us. So, okay. So, out of the brightness before him, coals of fire flamed forth. This is, the image of God as a warrior God. And so, what I love about this, because I rely on smart people for my information. Let's be clear about that. I don't come up with all of the stuff out of my own head, and you need to be grateful for that. But while God is cloaked in darkness, as he's described here, he is brilliant. He's emitting fiery coals, or other translations have flashes of lightning before him. And in Exodus 24:17, we have another description that's kind of parallel. It says, "Now the appearance of glory of the Lord was like devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel." And we have so many other places in the Bible where God's presence is described as a fire. Now, typically in Christian circles, you start talking about fire, people's minds automatically go to hellfire and damnation. We're talking about judgment and wrath. And while that, is accurate because we do have those descriptors, there's another aspect of this fiery manifestation of God. Look in Exodus 24:18 as we, a little further down, the next verse down from what I just read. It says, Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain. And Moses was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. So Moses is in the middle of this devouring fire. That was the manifestation of God's presence. So this fiery aspect of God is not always something that we should fear. It actually draws and leads those people who love him towards him. And so the light kind of serves a dual purpose. It's comfort and protection for God's children, and it's wrath and judgment for those who dare to harm his children. And the light takes the form of arrows. They're routing God's enemies. He is attacking those who are against God, and it's matched in his thundering voice. Weather, and I'm talking, meteorological terms are both literal and metaphorical, and they fall under the authority of God, manifesting his will. So, we have all these storm gods. We have all these gods who are capable of throwing lightning bolts or causing rain, causing earthquakes, all these things that can happen. And God encompasses every aspect of them. He's not limited to one element of nature. He controls them all. But here's the really cool thing. If you look at those mythologies that have these, lightning bolt wielding gods, they all have to have that created by another god. Another god forges the lightning bolt. Another god builds it for them. And then this god is the one who uses it as a weapon. God doesn't need someone else to create this weapon for him. God doesn't need someone else to provide it for him. He actually doesn't have a created weapon. It's something that flows from him. It emanates from him. And once again, we see how this language demonstrates that God is superior to all these other gods. Then we have this reference to the Red Sea, the parting of the water, and it's an act accomplished with a word. It's actually less than a word. It's a blast of his nostril. He doesn't have to speak. He just breathes and it happens. And so one of the most feared symbols of chaos in the ancient world was the sea. And it's unpredictable, it's violent, and here it's just controlled with a mere exhale, a sigh from God. No other God could claim such a feat. So again, we have that superiority just really driven home. Verse 17, he sent from on high, he took me and drew me out of many waters. Alter translates this as he reached from on high and took me. So Bergen notes that David's life is never described as being in danger from waters. We don't have any great voyage of David, which might have been actually an interesting story if somebody had chosen to write one. But anyway, Zamora sees this as a connection to the ancient myths where the head gods are, of most of the pantheons, they're the head god because they did conquer the sea. They conquered those chaos monsters that were supposed to be in the sea. And if Zamora is correct, then David is shifting the focus from historical, which we've got these historical events that he's been recounting, to a cosmic spiritual event, and where God is fierce and he's terrible in his protection of the people. So verse 18, he rescued me from my strong enemy, from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. They confronted me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my support. So David simultaneously presents us with these interlocking planes of reality playing out together. And we have the historical national, where we look back at the Exodus, we have the cosmic spiritual, and we have the personal tangible. So all of these things, they are intertwined and they're not distinct from each other. They have to be together. And all three play out together, influencing each other and being influenced by each other. And all focus on the interdependence between man and God. So, or humanity and God, if I want to be more inclusive. So the idea that you don't have the physical apart from the spiritual, and the spiritual is not indifferent to the physical. You have to have all of these things together. Why? Because that's how God designed it. We were never supposed to bifurcate the spiritual and the mundane, or the spiritual and the tangible. It's all supposed to play together.
Mm-hmm.
And, we should really be asking why this is important. And the reason why all this is important is because we have a God who actually deigns to intervene in the affairs of humanity. We have a spiritual God who is not relegated to the spiritual world. He actually rides his cherubs. He transverses that boundary between the spiritual and the physical so he can be a part of our life. And so David tells you why God does this. This is verse 20. He brought me into a broad place. He rescued me because he was delighted in me. Now, for a lot of Christians, that is like a crazy statement. The idea that God could delight in humanity, in any person, when we're so wretched and sinful, and how could anybody say that God delights in them when we know God hates humans? Okay, I'm being a little flippant there.
But that is the impression that we get from some very popular Bible teachers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like God loves us through gritted teeth. He just barely tolerates our existence, and the only reason why he is willing to actually save us is because he said he would, and it's to bring him more glory. It's not about establishing a relationship. It's not about the individual having significance. It's about his glory. Is God glorified whenever he is operating with humanity and accomplishing his will through an individual person? Absolutely. But there's still room for that individual. He allows us to express these elements of him through unique elements of him through unique individuals. And that delights him. And I think sometimes we forget that there is it's not about wrath and judgment and trying to create this oppressive relationship where the human has no input, no role to play. He just becomes this little mindless robot, which God can control. This really is about being able to still maintain the image of the creator and participate with the creator, but to do so in a way that is willing and celebrates our individuality as humans. And this has been taken too far in some circles. I get that. We often hear the argument made, well, this is just how God made me, and if you love me, then you're going to have to accept me this way.
Hmm.
Th- That's not what I'm saying. God always transforms. He always transforms. He's conforming us to the image of Christ. We have an obligation to die to self. We have an obligation to actually put to death those things that separate us from him. That's part of our responsibility within the relationship. And so we don't want to overlook the fact that this isn't just carte blanche permission to do whatever we want, but this is not saying that we have to be less than who God wants us to be. And so this is why it's so important that we excuse me, that we study the word and that we try to figure out what pleases God. Because this is what we do with someone we love. What pleases them? How can we be of service to them, not out of some kind of dread, but because it's a joy to foster and to nourish that relationship through these acts of service. And I'm not saying that's what saves you, but if you are saved, you should be inspired to do so. So anyway, not in my note. And now we're going to go to the next stanza. And I want to read the entirety of this because this is where it just gets wild. And there is people who have come against this part and said there's issues with these next few verses. And we want to talk about how this plays out and how do we reconcile what David is about to say with what has happened in his life. So, got a puppy helping me. Verse 21. The Lord dealt with me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands, he rewarded me. For I have kept the way of the Lord. I have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his rules were before me, and from his statutes I did not turn aside. I was blameless before him, and I kept myself from guilt. And the Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness and according to my cleanness in his sight. So I see the wheels turning.
No, this is a very interesting passage, and you've alluded to some of the stuff you're going to talk about with me on the phone, or earlier, or in our past conversation. So I'm really curious to see what you got going on here.
Okay, because this flies in the face of what so many of us have been taught, particularly in regards to the total depravity of man. Human beings are so vile and sinful that if God gave us exactly what we deserve, then we'd all be burning in hell. And yet, David seems to be making a statement that is completely contrary to what we find in Scripture later on and in other places. So, in order to try not to muddy the waters too much, let's stick with David and let's look at the context of David. So, we know that David sinned, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've got this very glaring sin, which everybody wants to point to. That's Bathsheba and Uriah. I won't go back into that story because I think we covered it well in our last one. David sinned multiple times outside of that. He's committed sins that under the Torah are worthy of death. He should have been stoned for some of the things he did, according to God's own word. That's never covered up. That's never hidden in the Bible. It's not, Chronicles leaves it out, but they're telling a different story, but we still have it revealed very plainly in the book of Samuel. And here David is saying, I didn't turn aside from God's law. I did what was right. I'm righteous. And even more than that, what's crazy, God is responding to David as if what David is saying is true. So he just told us that God tilted the heavens on his behalf because David cried out to him. And so, in the most plain, simple reading, and this is why you've got to be careful when somebody tells you, hey, let's stick to the plain reading of the text. Okay, fine. let's do that. But the plain reading of the text needs to include context. If you don't have the context, you're not getting the plain reading of the text. You're getting a twisted half reading of the text.
Yeah. And of course, as soon
So,
as you try to add context, you're accused of trying to contextualize the Bible away. And I'm sorry, but if your interpretation cannot, I mentioned this before we were on the phone, before we started recording, but if your
I know exactly
interpretation
what you're
of the
gonna say.
Bible cannot withstand the context of the Bible, then it's wrong. You're done. There's nowhere
Mhm.
you can go. You can't sustain it if your reading of a portion just can't stand up to just adding the verses before and after, or
Mhm.
even, or the whole book, or even something in another book. It's a wrong
Right.
interpretation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And context does matter. And that's rule number 2, context, context, context. I mean, we cannot drive that home enough, because too often when you pull a section of the Bible out of context, you wind up with something that is heretical or blasphemous. And right here, where David's saying, I, me, we know that is not the appropriate interpretation taken on its own. And so we need to be willing to look at this statement within the context of the psalm, but also within the context of the one who wrote the psalm. And that's one of the beautiful things about having this in the book of Samuel and not just in the psalm book itself. We actually have it attributed to David. And there's going to be people who say it absolutely could not be David who wrote it. Okay, fine, whatever. The point is, whoever put this in this book and said David did write it, believe that it was an accurate enough description of David's relationship with God that it could be attributed to him. And so this is the way God has chosen to preserve it. So that's the way we're going to take it, that it is the words of David, or at least is an accurate reflection of David's relationship with God.
What you mean God knew what he was doing when he wrote the Bible, or when he had people compile the Bible, or however you want to look at it? I mean, I still
it's
struggle with
crazy.
the proper language for that.
Well, I think it's really awesome that God did decide to include people knowing full well that we could mess it up, and He allowed us the grace and freedom to actually participate without erasing our minds and ability to think. And so, you know, I don't understand why anybody would have a problem with that. I don't. But maybe it's because I think God does love individuals and God does trust humanity to a certain degree. And
Mhm.
He knows our hearts, He knows our desires, and He even knows when we act out of sync with our hearts and desires.
Mhm.
Paul even talks about how he does things he doesn't want to do. And sometimes this happens. Why? Because we're flawed human beings, but God looks to the heart. He doesn't see things as people see things. He says that earlier in this very book we're studying. So, there's that's the beautiful thing when we're dealing about an omniscient God. He knows everything. He doesn't just know what's on the surface of who we are. He actually looks beyond that. And sometimes what's beyond the surface is something so much more amazing than we will ever present to the world. And that's what God responds to. So, um, now, in the tradition we were raised in, these statements would pretty much be nothing short of blasphemous, because how could anybody say that? Only Jesus could say that. And yet, here's David making these proclamations about himself. And so, what do we do with these statements that really, if you just want to take a plain reading of the text, are demonstrably false? And so, this poses a problem to theologians who cannot look beyond. So, David David's life operates under the dictates of the Torah. This is where he is. This is before Christ. This is before the New Testament, obviously. But the Torah is God's revealed word to Israel at that time. Everyone was obligated, from the least person in the kingdom all the way up to the king. They're
Mhm.
supposed to follow the Torah. Okay. So that's the first point. So God gave the parameters. This is how you interact with me. This is how you receive blessings. And if you go back to Deuteronomy, so often what God says, if you do this, I will do that. If you honor me, I'll bless you. If you dishonor me, I'll curse you. It's an if then. You get to decide how you're going to participate with the rules God has set in place. The second thing we need to know is when David writes this, he's nearing the end of his life. This is the end of his reign. Many, many years have passed since the events between David, Bathsheba, and Uriah. And we know this because when Saul takes the throne, he's at least 12, according to some sources, but most sources lean more to 19, 20 years old. Solomon was not born until after the events with Bathsheba and Uriah.
Mhm.
So we've got at least probably a couple of decades, at least one, between these events. And we know that David repented of his sins. We've got Psalm 51 lays out David's repentance in graphic, specific ways. And we know that whenever David takes the census, we've already talked about that, even though it comes later in the book. We've already talked about that. David gets it. No prophet had to confront him. Nobody had to reveal to him what he did wrong. He knew it, and he responded. He immediately began his process of repentance. So it's helpful to remember what David said in Psalm 51 about repentance. And he says, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity. Cleanse me from my sins. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow." So David's acknowledged with his life prior to this psalm that his righteousness, his cleanliness does not depend on him. It depends on God. And so David repented, and David in faith believed that God responded to do all that David had asked of him. So in other words, David's standing in 2 Samuel 22 is not reliant on what David had actually done. David's standing before God is actually reliant on what God has declared he will do for those who repent. So we can't take this stanza of the song and read it apart from what David has already revealed to us to be true throughout his life,
Mhm.
which is when God says he forgives, when God says he cleans, God purges, we really are whiter than snow. Everything's gone. It's not that, oh, well, I asked for forgiveness and I'm going to get into heaven, but I'm still this lousy sinner. No, it's God's work is complete. We don't have to worry about whether or not the sins that we've committed still are held against us in some kind of little, it's not like a human interaction. I mean, because how many times have we messed up, we either on purpose or not, and we've gone to our spouse and said, "Hey, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that." But then your spouse is just waiting for you to do it again. Or maybe you're waiting on your spouse to do it again. And so there's kind of that little bit of what if kind of creeping in, and that starts to influence your interactions. And you really have to work against that. That's not a great way to conduct a marriage, by the way. I should clarify that. That's just human nature, and we have to work against it. God doesn't do that. And so when we say, "Hey, God's forgiven me," we need to actually believe that's true. And David is exhibiting a very high level of faith. This is a faith statement by David about not him, but about the nature of God's forgiveness and God's restoration. And so this is taking Psalm 51, taking that repentance process into account radically changes the plain reading of the text, because the plain reading of the text isn't about what David's done. It's about David's faith in what God has done.
Mhm.
And so he is claiming the promises of God with full faith. And that's what we need to be recognizing about David's statement here. When you repent, when you go to God and you are trying to do the best you can to restore that relationship and draw closer to him, God is faithful to uphold his promises to make that a reality. And that's where David is at this point in his life. Now, we've talked about before, a little bit more context. These last 4 chapters are not chronological. We know that. And they're actually put in this order for a very specific reason. But if we look at the chronology, and the reason why we want to look at the chronology is we want to look at Saul who came before, Saul who never repents, Saul who never seeks God's forgiveness, and then we go forward into the book of Kings, which a lot of scholars believe they're the same book, that they all flow together. We're going to find that what this does is demonstrate a distinction between David and the evil kings that follow in the book of Kings. So David's sins are singular events, okay? The reason why Bathsheba and Uriah's story is so startling and so jarring within the context of David's story is because we don't expect it from him.
Mhm.
It's out of character. It's not what we want from the king that God appointed. And also, when we look at these other kings in the future, when the prophet comes to them, the prophets are scared to approach the king. Why? Because the king might have them killed. Most of the time, these kings reject what the prophet has to say. They don't want to hear it. They try to silence God's prophets. David never does that. And David, because he's able to hear the words of the prophets, he's able to respond. He becomes the measuring stick, if you will, of what it looks like to be a good king.
Mhm.
And so either the kings are good and they turn their hearts towards God, or they're evil and they turn their hearts away from God. And
Yeah.
so that's how they're remembered.
Yeah,
Go
well,
ahead.
and it says he didn't depart from God, and that's the thing is like you're saying, these other kings, they departed, they went and worshipped idols, where David screwed
Mhm.
up but repented, and I
Yes.
think that's kind of what you're
Mhm.
overall trying to say, um, just a little
Mhm.
more concisely. But where you have the other kings that they actually set up idols when they were disappointed with the way things were going with Yahweh, and so
Mhm.
that to me, I think that is the difference, like you said, and then David trusting God's repentance or God's forgiveness when David repents.
Mhm.
So that is a pretty amazing way to look at things.
Well, I think we forget that when we accept God's promises, they need to be accepted for ourselves. I talked to friends several times. They said, I can believe anything in the world is true for you. I can have great faith in God's ability to do things for you. But if I want to be very real, sometimes what I have a problem with is believing that what God says is true about me or having faith in God moving for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the fact that David's able to have this level of faith, that's more inspiring to me than him walking out in front of a Goliath and the giants. I mean, honestly, my temperament's such that going out in front of a giant actually would be far less scary than actually saying, okay, all the stuff that God says is true is really actually absolutely true. I don't know if it's personality or upbringing, but the idea of me going, God dealt with me according to my righteousness kind of makes me wince. So that's a scary thought. But, you know, when David is used as the biblical example, and this is another thing I think we need to point out, we're not implying that David is the ultimate standard of righteousness. We're not saying that we should compare ourselves to another human being. God is the one who said David is the measuring stick. And God spells it out that David's faith and David's devotion was sufficient for him to be considered an exemplary king at that time. And we're going to, when we get into those stories, we're going to see how evil these kings are. And a real quick example that I think everyone kind of knows would be Ahab and Jezebel. And so, those were evil kings. That sin was entrenched. David's sin is a one off. And, but within this passage, David really defines what righteousness looks like. He tells us what his basis for this. He says, I've kept the ways of the Lord. And in so many things he did, I mean, even consider the fact that he could have killed Saul a couple of different times, and he didn't do it because he had faith that God would actually fulfill his word. I have not wickedly departed from God. This is what you were saying. He never turned his back on God. He might have stepped away. He might have looked away, but he never turned his back. From his statutes, I did not turn aside. So there were, yes, with Bathsheba, he absolutely forgot what he was supposed to do, and he willingly sinned against God and her and Uriah, but he still acknowledged that God's statutes were the proper way to measure his life. He never disregarded them as irrelevant or unnatural, or what's the word I'm looking for? It was not wrong. They weren't overwhelming. They shouldn't be. There's a specific word here that is in my head. It's so many people don't want to follow the laws, and they look at the laws that God set down, and I'm not talking about Old Testament laws, I'm talking about it even as a New Testament believer, and they're like, that's just too hard. As a human being, I can't do that. That oppresses me as a human being. David doesn't do that. David recognizes that God's laws are perfect. And so he says he kept himself from guilt. This is David's list of what righteousness looks like, which is precisely the opposite of what the evil kings did, because they do, like you said, they turn to idolatry, they reject God's laws. And in doing so, they actually remove themselves and the nation from God's provision and blessing. And so this isn't about unfeeling legalism or blind piety in an effort to pay God off, because we do know that that happens. There are some kings who are going to do that later on in the book of Kings, and God's like, your lips, you serve me with your lips, but your hearts were far from me. This is a devotion, a core devotion to God. And if you go back and you read the beginning of the psalm, and you read all of this in context, I know that it's been, 2 weeks now? And so, but if you go back to those verses, you cannot read this psalm as anything but an impassioned declaration of David's devotion for God and God's devotion for David. This is not cold. This is not legalistic. This is not blind. This is eyes wide open celebration of a relationship that is embodied by a fiery God. So we need to really be paying attention to the context. So David goes on and he explains how God deals with humanity. He says in verse 26, with the merciful, you show yourself merciful. And with the blameless, you show yourself blameless. With the purified, you deal purely. With the crooked, you make yourself seem torturous. You save a humble people, but your eyes are on the haughty people to bring them down. So David declares that God deals with different people in different ways. Oh my gosh, now I hear somebody going, but God is no respecter of persons. Okay. God has always made it clear in his book that if you love and honor him, he loves and honors you. If you reject him, if you defy him, you're going to get that part of him that deals with that. So David's basically saying God matches the person. For some people, this is going to be a really crazy concept, because this means the person, you as an individual, you get to decide how God is going to deal with you. If you want God's mercy, then you need to be merciful. And you do this through acts and expression of merciful love. And that's what God's going to match. Blameless, this means to be whole, to be sound, complete. Noah was blameless in his generation. It's the same word used of the sacrificial animals later on. Abraham in Genesis 17:1 is called to be blameless in order that God may make a covenant with them. And, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, again, those animals, so many times, I didn't even write them all down. In Deuteronomy 32:4, God's works are perfect or blameless. And David says there are those that God sees as blameless. There are people that God actually views that way. And those are the ones that God will show himself to be blameless. So in other words, because it's like, well, how do you blame God? Let's rephrase it some so we can wrap our heads around it. God is acting in integrity. He's honoring his words and promises to humanity. Or to put it another way, God will not be blamed for breaking his promises or blamed for breaking his word, because God is always true to his word. So the next line kind of illustrates the difficulty in translating poetic speech, especially when you're translating from one language to another, because in order to translate this word that we're getting into, the meaning of the verb, you have to add a bunch of verbs in the English that kind of breaks the flow.
Mhm.
And so the ESV says, "To the crooked, you make yourself be torturous." Alter translates it with "perverse, you twist and turn." Art Scroll has, "With the corrupt, you act perversely." Zamora says, "Towards the crooked, you show yourself perverse." But then he also notes that this word for perverse can be shrewd, astute, subtle, devious. Young's literal translation had actually wrestler. So I thought that was an interesting translation. Um, but all these words kind of have a bad taste in our mouth. They aren't the words that we like to use to apply to God.
Right.
Um, so it's there's the consistency within the stanza that would actually demand almost that to the perverse you show yourself to be perverse, because we have those parallelisms.
Mhm.
Um, but we need to remember God is dealing with each person as they've presented themselves to Him, as they've shown themselves to be, and to make a claim of any god, to make this claim is unheard of. The ancient gods didn't allow themselves to be predictable. They were inscrutable. They were unpredictable because there were no rules. There were no rules
Mhm.
for the people, and there were no rules for the god themselves. And God is above that. God actually is consistent, and He doesn't change the rules to deal with one person one way or another person another way outside the rules. He actually has laid a system in place, and it's very plainly pointed out. And I have people who have issues with this in Deuteronomy. If you do this, then I will do that.
Mhm.
You have the choice. You have the responsibility and the obligation. And as a matter of fact, you cannot avoid making the choice to honor God or not. And when you make the choice to honor God and to love Him, then He blesses you. If you don't, then He doesn't. And not having the blessing of God in your life is the same as being cursed, pretty much, because you need God's provision. You need His sustenance. You need His grace, His mercy, and love if you're going to enjoy life on this earth. So, the great thing about this, and I think we shouldn't miss this, is this means that humanity doesn't have to cower before God in abject terror of what He might do next. We tremble at His holiness, and we're in awe of His glory, but we don't have to hide in fear of some inexplicable act of retribution that we don't understand why it happened. There's not a whim or some fleeting caprice that makes God deal with us one way one day and then a different way the next. There is some kind of order to this, because why? God's not a God of chaos. And so, in laying down these very clear expectations and these very, just simple rules for humanity, it's a way that allows us to be confident in His kindness and His holiness and His love. And that's what David is saying here. I did not turn aside from your laws. Why? Because they're the right thing to do. And because I didn't turn away from them, I can count on you to behave in this manner. And
Mhm.
that's the thing. It's not about rules so much as it is about God's character. And that's what the rules reveal. They reveal God's character, a character and a heart that can be trusted to do the best for humanity. And so I want to be careful here too, because somebody's going to be like, well, it sounds like you're controlling God. No, because God is the one who laid out the parameters. God's the
Mhm.
one who said, this is how it works. And we operate within those parameters. Now, if I try to say, okay, God, I don't like those rules, let me rewrite some, and I'm going to say we're going to do this, this, and this, and now you have to respond according to the rules I laid out. Now I'm trying to control God. If I'm just simply taking Him at His word as He's preserved it in our Bibles, now I can say, I am actually bowing to the dictates of God, and I'm bowing to the revealed will of God as presented to me. And He says, I can count on Him to do these things. This is not anyone dictating. This is actually just accepting and believing His promises. And so, I think we need to be aware that God's character can be trusted. because I think that when you grow up, and I do a lot of interaction with people who've come out of some very strict denominations where God is just waiting for an excuse to zap you dead. And, he wants to have some minor little reason. You tied your shoes wrong, so now he can inflict all kinds of suffering in your life.
And the only thing stopping him is Jesus.
Yeah, yeah. And we don't know if Jesus can really do that. There's this dread. There is this real fear of God. Even people who say they've walked away from religion and Christianity, a lot of times their stories will say, I still have nightmares about hell. I still have, even though I don't believe hell's real, I'm still in fear of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is not something bad being said about God here to say that with the perverse, he makes himself perverse. This is actually a revelation of his character that should free us, that says, I get to choose how God interacts with me because he told me these are the things I can rely on.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and so this is freedom.
And we but we don't bat an eye when we hear Jesus say, do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Right.
And how we, and if we're all made in the image of God and how we relate to each other is supposed to help us learn about how we relate to God. I mean, I don't understand where the breakdown is.
Well, and this is the thing. When you start to take some of these, okay, I'm going to say something's going to sound wrong, so just bear with me. When you take some of these lighter, fluffier parts of the Bible and make them specific, or you play out the practical, logical ramifications of what's being said, that's when people start getting appalled. Sometimes truth doesn't look so great cross-stitched and hanging over the sofa. Sometimes truth can be very appalling. And sometimes truth, when it is appalling, is actually the best. It's the deepest, it's the richest, and it is the one that has the most power. And so maybe instead of recoiling from things in the Bible that kind of make us uncomfortable and going, well, I just don't understand that. How many times have I heard that when I've had people, would talk about a passage that's hard? Well, I just don't understand that. And they pull back and they don't want to look at it because that's an image of God that they don't want to really grapple with. Maybe we just need to dive in deeper. Maybe we need to, like we were talking at the beginning, go back and study, what does this really mean? And stop having that knee-jerk reaction that limits you in what you can accept from God.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying it's wrong to have a reaction. We're not, okay, emotional reactions are like physical reflexes. We don't have control of that. Okay, that's fine. But the minute you put a thought into it, now it becomes a response. And we are responsible for our responses.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe we need to actually take responsibility for our responses and say, even though this makes me uncomfortable, I'm going to push in deeper. I'm going to try to understand more because God says he's faithful. God says he's going to give understanding and wisdom to those who seek it.
Mm-hmm.
And so being uncomfortable with something isn't because there's a problem with God. If you're uncomfortable with something in the Bible, it's because there's a problem in you. And God's trying to use that revelation in the Word to root that out and bring you more into alignment where you can enjoy the blessing and benefit of his presence in your life. Is that preaching? Did I go too far? Anyway, because...
No, it makes sense. And it's right there. If you just understand what the Bible's saying and let the Bible speak for itself and not have to filter it through all of the cultural and traditional things that we've decided to tack onto it over the years.
Mm-hmm.
And I realize that we're not ever going to get completely away from some of those things because
it's who we are.
It's who we are, and there's a lifetime's worth of correction to be done in every single person. And fortunately, there's more than a lifetime's worth of wisdom going on in the Bible, and our God's bigger than that. And he is forgiving, and he is loving, and he does go after us. So it's not,
he delights in us.
Yeah. So
you take that statement alone and try to actually think about what that means. Because for so many people, the idea that God might delight in Pastor so-and-so and Sister Susie, but the idea that the regular, normal person, God can delight in them, well, that's kind of the whole point of the psalm, because when we talked about this last week, the psalm isn't just about a king's experience with God. I talked about it at the beginning of this episode. Anyway, it's about all of humanity's claim to God, that God would actually deal this way with all of humanity. That's where the no respecter of persons comes in. Everyone can claim the promises and live in the truth that's revealed here.
Mhm.
Not just a king, not just a priest, not just the guy on television thumping his Bible. This is everyone. And so you just have to submit yourself to the authority of God in order to get there. I mean, it's crazy simple. So crazy simple. And yet we want to complicate it. And it doesn't really have to be all that complicated. It can be so plain and simple that a child can understand it. Jesus promised us that. So, I mean, come on. The deeper stuff, the more convoluted stuff, the complex ideologies, this is what we do for fun. Why? Because we want to know more about the God we claim to worship, love, and serve.
Mhm.
It's not because if I don't get this nailed down, I can't be saved. It's because we want to know more about him. But I think that's a really good
that's a good
place to stop.
Yeah, that's a good stopping point.
Because we're going to go into the next, we're going to actually bring up Beatitudes. And I know that's one of your favorite passages.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. There's a whole lot there. So yeah, I think that's a good place to break. Everyone, until next time, be part of the conversation. RavenCreekSC.com is the website. Gets you to this show, other shows that Raven Creek hosts. I think we're up to 7 different podcasts we're hosting now.
Don't know.
Which are
I lost track.
Which I love. If you haven't checked out the Open Wallet podcast with Joe and Katie Zaragoza, that one is a lot of fun. They're married. They're talking about their financial journey. They're not experts, but they are doing some research and figuring out what works, what doesn't. How to move forward, and they're doing it in a way where they're trying to respect people, and that there are different pathways. I had a conversation with Joe a few weeks ago. I called him up to just discuss some of the Raven Creek stuff that's going on, and one of the things that I really liked that he said was almost every single one of the big name Christian financial people or groups, they're always like, well, you have to do this without exception, all the time if you want to be rich. And he's like, they're all of them are talking about being rich. He's like, well, maybe some of us don't necessarily have the goal of being rich in mind. Maybe we just want to be responsible and have a good financial future and go into retirement set up well to be able to live our lives. It's not about being rich necessarily. So I thought that was very insightful and really cool. So go check them out. They're a lot of fun. And it's just good conversation and some useful information, and also some fun. They actually did a podcast on what if you won the lottery, so there's kind of, some outside the box things that you're not going to hear on other things. But that being said, be part of the conversation. Hit us up on the website, on the social media, Raven Creek SC, or if you just search Raven Creek Social Club, I'm sure you'll find something we've done for better or worse. So have a good one. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening, and don't forget to join us next week.
This is the Open Wallet Podcast, an exploration of personal finance. I'm Katie, a numbers nerd.
And I'm Joe, a 40-year-old punk rocker.
And we're married.
We're here to talk about and figure out all the personal finance questions we all deal with, like,
how do I read my pay stub?
How do I dress better on a budget?
How do I start an emergency fund?
What goes into buying a house?
And lots more.
So join us on Open Wallet Podcast on iTunes or wherever you find podcasts.